manager on the Office Information Protection team, and I'm joined on stage actually with my peers across Microsoft in the Office Applications team, as well as on the Azure Information Protection team. Hopefully this sort of highlights to you how we're really bringing together the technologies that we provide and that you use and deploy so that it's easier for you to manage and protect your content. Just as a quick level set, if you have questions, we're going to try and leave time at the end of the session for that. So if you can hold your questions till then, that'll be great. As I mentioned, we have a lot of different investments that we've been making and highlighting today and yesterday at Ignite. For today, we're going to be focusing on some of the investments we're making in our sort of security pillar around information protection and how you can keep that content secure throughout its life cycle. I'm sure many of you in this room are quite familiar with the life cycle of your data today. We no longer live in a world where we could rely on that content being safe behind some firewall or on some private network. Content roams everywhere, and in fact, you want it to roam everywhere. You want to enable your users to collaborate securely and to work in a friction-free way that is in compliance with your security policies so that as they collaborate, as they share that content with your business partners or with your customers, it's secured and it's protected in a way that meets your business and compliance policies. So to distill down this problem, we've kind of broken down this into sort of 4 key pillars that distill how do you protect information as it roams and as it lives across the digital estate, I guess, as they say. First, it's critical that you're able to discover your data. This is about what is my sensitive data? How do I find my sensitive data? Who's using my sensitive data? Where, and ultimately, where is it? Tell me about my sensitive data. Once you discover that and you're able to uniformly detect and define that data, you've done all that laborious exercise to find that, you want to classify that content. And what that means is you're actually able to apply a sticker or a stamp or a label to that content that now persists with the content throughout its life cycle. So you know you found a highly confidential document or you found a patent submission. Now you can assign that classification based upon your discovery data that you've defined, and then that classification lives on with that document. You don't need to reclassify it, you don't need to rescan it or recompute what it is, and all of your different systems that are feeding off of those signals can uniformly detect the same kind of content. And of course, once you've now accurately detected that sensitive data and you've applied that classification, it gives you a means to start protecting it, applying your control policies, whether that's access controls or data governance. Ultimately, you get the flexibility to define what are the outcomes that you need. And of course, last but certainly not least is that visibility, monitoring the usage of that data as it roams throughout your organization with your business partners and being able to understand how it's being used and confirm it's meeting your business policies. So there's a whole variety of different technologies that we've built that are founded or that are built upon that foundational concept of discover, classify, protect, and monitor. Hopefully you heard about some of them earlier today, and there are many different sessions. We have a slide at the end that talks about several of the other sessions that give a deep dive into some of these different technologies. But what we want you to hopefully understand is, if you have your Office technologies deployed, or if you have Azure Information Protection deployed, you're on the right path to use our information protection technologies, and it's only going to get easier and better for you to use these technologies together. For today, we're going to zoom in on a couple of these few different areas, specifically around Azure Information Protection, Office applications, SharePoint, sites and groups, as well as touching on Windows Information Protection for endpoint protection. Before I jump in really quick, can I get a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center? Awesome. Excellent. Great to see. Almost everybody raised your hand. That's a good sign. Now, how many have deployed any form of a classification or labeling solution in your organization? A couple. Excellent. And now one last question. How many have deployed Azure Information Protection? Is that the... OK. Excellent. So Azure team's happy. We're all happy. So excellent, that's great. I think what we'll talk to you about today will have a lot of relevance to if you're an existing Azure customer, what we're building is going to help you don't have to reinvent the wheel with your labeling solution. We're going to help you bring along. And if you haven't deployed yet, we're going to show you how easy it is for you to get started and use our unified labeling solution. So as I mentioned, unified labeling, when you think about how do you protect and govern your data and apply those actions, we want to talk a little bit about how that breaks down and what are the different technologies that we use to achieve these. Of course, on the top there, you can see that unified approach. How do you discover your content, uniformly define what that content is, classify it, and then apply the label so that you can start to protect or retain that content? Now, within our system, we have a multi-category labeling system. And these categories are intended to meet different business or compliance or security needs depending upon what your organization is trying to achieve. We have sensitivity labels. These are how you protect your content. You can apply content marking or encryption to control access, as well as content marking to help your users understand when they're working on sensitive data. And then, of course, we have retention labels, which you use to govern your data, to define how long is a given record need to be preserved for your organization. Do I want to declare it an immutable record? Or when is it critical that that's purged, so I'm not holding on to data that's potentially putting my organization at risk? And then across the board, that uniform ability to monitor and detect where that label is applied to the content, how it's being used, and how it's being protected. Now, the sensitivity label is what we want to talk to you today about. This is one of the sort of the new pieces of our unified labeling story that we're bringing into the Security and Compliance Center, and we'll show that to you here in just a moment. The purpose of the sensitivity label is for you to get a way for you and your users to be able to start to tag content and specify how sensitive is this content to my organization? Is it a personal record that I'm not really worried about? Is it a patent submission that I have some very specific usage restrictions around? Is it highly confidential data that shouldn't leave my organization? And so the sensitivity label is intended to help you meet those specific needs when you're classifying a given piece of content. Now, you can fully customize what are the labels in your organization. We have some easy sort of defaults that we recommend you use to get started, but you can customize these to your heart's content and really have the flexibility and control to choose who has or who's able to apply different types of labels, who's able to access content that has specific labels on them. But as I mentioned, this label is persistent, so it lives with the content. So the minute that a user authors a document and assigns a highly confidential label to it, if they share it with somebody outside the organization or share it with a business partner, that highly confidential ranking lives with the document, as well as any of the protection settings that you've specified in your admin-defined policy. Now, what's unique and great about the way that these tags are persisted, it's done in a clear text way. And why that's important is now if you have third-party systems, if you have other systems that want to be able to feed off of that classification, it's easy for them to do so. So it's available for all of these different technologies to be able to trigger. And ultimately, that's your foundation for how do you apply different enforcement actions and data protection policies to your content. Now, this applies to files and documents today. Files, documents, emails, you can, as you're authoring in Office applications, if you're sending an email, you're able to assign the label to that content. We'll also show you how you can use our sensitivity labels to apply uniform access controls to SharePoint sites. So now as your users are creating sites, you as an admin can make sure that the permissions and capabilities and ability to download that content is secured per your organizational policy. And of course, another key facet of our Microsoft Information Protection sort of vision is that third parties and there's an ecosystem that's part of this. So hopefully you were at the keynote just a couple minutes ago where we talked about Adobe. Adobe has integrated labeling capabilities right into their native applications. So as you're working, as you configure and deploy your labels in your organization, your users that are working on Adobe content are able to assign that label to their content. And we have an SDK that's enabling other application developers and service providers to join the party, so to speak, and able to detect as well as apply the same labels to your content as it roams throughout the ecosystem. So depending on which technologies you have deployed, we want to make it easy for you to really rely on these labels as a consistent mechanism to protect your content. Alrighty, so I'm going to show a quick demonstration here of how easy it is to get going with sensitivity labels. To do so, I'm going to switch on over to the new Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Now this, hopefully you've seen a couple of sessions today and yesterday around the new administrative console. Oh, alrighty, sorry, thank you. Apparently my still presenting, so give me a quick moment. Excellent. All right, so now I'm back at the Microsoft 365 Admin Console. This is the new cohesive admin experience where we're bringing together a lot of the different capabilities to make it easier for you to find one place for you to manage and protect your organization across Office. And in a moment, we'll dig into the security and the protection centers, which are dedicated to your personas that manage security or manage compliance. But for today, what I'm going to show you here is I'm on the Microsoft Admin Center homepage. And there's a recommendation that's surfaced to me here. And the intent of this recommendation is actually, it's helping me understand that my users, I'm a normal Office 365 organization. My users are uploading and sharing and collaborating on content. And what I've learned here is that they're actually sharing some sensitive information that hasn't been labeled. It hasn't been classified. I don't know if it's general. I don't know if it's highly confidential. I don't know if they're doing the right thing with that content, because I don't know what it is. So what we've tried to do is make it super easy for you to get started with these labels, to start to deploy them, turn them on for your users, so you can start to get that basic classification in place and start to protecting your content and take advantage of all these cool capabilities. So here I'm just clicked into the view recommendation. What this is telling me is, hey, we have a set of default labels we suggest you use to get started. These labels have some built-in protection behind them. So for general content, we'll maybe have a very subtle footer that says, hey, this is Contoso confidential. But for my confidential data, or my highly confidential data, I will have access restrictions that assure that the people that access that content, even if they happen to download it from a site that I don't own, it will be protected in a way that assures that only the right authorized users are able to access it. Now, what's great about this experience is it makes it super easy for you to get started with labels. I can just pick the few labels that I want to use. For my organization, I don't want my users labeling their personal documents. I'm going to encourage only using company data. And I have a choice here. I can actually just very quickly deploy this to everyone in my organization. Or if you're just getting started with labels, you aren't quite sure if you're ready yet, we made it super easy for you to start a pilot. So what you can do is you can be able to scroll in, select a group or a set of people that you want to start to evaluate how these labels work, and be able to publish to them right away. Now, you can always come back. You can customize this. You can change who has access to view these labels. And actually, Kartik here in just a moment will be showing you in depth what that looks like. Now, once I've chosen what labels I want to create and who I want those labels to be deployed to, I'm just going to go ahead and choose everyone. I can click Create, and that's going to go ahead and do all the heavy lifting for me. It's going to create the labels in the back end. It's going to create the policy. It's going to publish it to my users. And ultimately, when my users open up the Office applications that Mike will be showing here in just a moment, those labels will just appear. There's no additional deployment complexity that you're going to have to contend with to make these work. And the activation process is taking a moment, so bear with me for a moment here. But ultimately, what you can see here is after we've created the labels, something that we've heard pretty consistently from customers is, hey, I understand I have sort of two different licenses I can get for these things. Why on earth would I want? What do I get out of the box? Why would I want to upgrade? What do I get if I give you a little bit more? And so another thing that we've tried to make it very clear as part of this experience is what are the capabilities that you can get, and as well as make it easy for you to start to trial that. So I'm not going to show you the trial experience for the demonstrations today. We already have an E5 tenant. But ultimately, what this is telling me here is we can get additional capabilities, automatic classification of my content. So as users are in their Word applications and on a Windows desktop, they're able to see in real time a recommendation that tells them that they're working on sensitive content. You can actually even cause that label to be applied to the content automatically. And we're investing in additional ways, of course, to make it even easier for you to automatically apply and protect that content. And secondary to auto-classification is, of course, what I mentioned around the ecosystem. Your content doesn't just live in the Office cloud. Your users share and collaborate with a variety of different services. And so through the Microsoft Information Protection technologies, as I mentioned, through that SDK with our third-party protection providers and app providers, they'll be able to join the system and be able to trigger they'll be able to consume the labels that you've configured, be able to apply it to content, and ultimately apply that uniform protection that you've configured for your label content. All right, so I'm now going to go switch on over to Kartik, who's going to deep on how the label configuration works, what objectives can you achieve from these labels that we just deployed, and how does it help you protect your content. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Bas. So the first thing that we should take away from this session is there are going to be two categories of labels: sensitivity labels and retention labels. You'll have a single portal to manage these labels, which is the Security and Compliance Center. For this session, I'm going to focus on the admin experience for sensitivity labels, which is GA today for all our customers in North America, and it's rolling out worldwide and should be available within the next 2 weeks. So for my organization, I've already created 4 labels: public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. I'm going to focus on the confidential label and walk through the settings to understand what are the rich customer scenarios that can be enabled using labels. So the first customer scenario that we've always heard about is customers want to restrict access to specific users and groups and also define rights for those specific users and groups. This scenario can be met using the encryption settings. The admin has the ability to determine whether the encryption settings are applicable only for files and emails or just email. He can determine whether the access to the content should expire, should the user have access when he's offline. He can select the users in 3 ways: either all members of his tenant, or specific users or groups, or by providing an email address or domain which is within his organization or outside his organization. In addition, he can choose from a preset rights such as co-owner, author, reviewer, or he can even define custom rights. All of these are flexible settings for an admin. The next set of requirements that we hear from our customers are they want to enable visual markings such as header, footer, watermark, so that end users understand sensitive content based on these visual markings. For the confidential label, I've set up the watermark, header, and footer, and it's very easy for the admin to configure this based on his organization's needs. He can set the text, change the font size, define the layout, and so on. The next setting is related to data loss prevention. A number of customers have told us that sensitive data gets downloaded on their Windows devices, and they want to prevent sharing or loss of data from their Windows devices. One way to enable this is using endpoint protection on Windows with data loss prevention. So for the confidential label, I've enabled data loss prevention for your Windows devices. What this implies is, if I have a confidential label on my Windows device and I try to copy paste that content into a third-party app like Dropbox or Gmail or my USB device, it can be prevented. The next set of settings are related to SharePoint sites and groups. Customers have told us that the number of sites and groups that are getting created on a daily basis is exponential, and it's difficult for the admin to monitor the sites and groups, specifically from a guest user access policy perspective or from an unmanaged device access perspective. They want the owners of the sites and groups to determine the right actions and policies that should be applied to the sites and groups. This scenario can be enabled with this setting, the site and group settings. So what you see is for the confidential label, only members of the group can access that site. Guest users cannot be added to that group. Guest users cannot send emails to that group. And if you're accessing content from an unmanaged device, you're going to have limited access. You'll only be able to view the content but not download it or edit it. Auto labeling. Now we are going to provide intuitive user experience for manual labeling, but at the same time we need to enable how content can be automatically labeled or recommendations can be provided to end users based on the sensitivity of the data, either in their email or on their document. Also, number of organizations have historical content which has not been labeled, and we need to provide a solution by which existing data can get labeled. This is easily achievable using the auto labeling conditions, where you use the rich classification engine of Office 365 with out-of-box sensitive types or custom sensitive types. For the confidential label, I've set up an auto labeling condition based on credit card data, but this can be easily modified based on the sensitive types applicable to your organization. All of these settings are optional. You can actually create labels without any of these settings and use them only for the purpose of classification. Also, you can reorder the labels based on their sensitivity. Now, once the labels have been created, for them to be available in end users' apps or SharePoint sites or groups, they need to be published via a policy. So let me take you to the label policy page. Customers usually have two high-level requirements. The first one being they want to scope labels to a defined set of users or a defined department. We call that as a scoped policy. So in this case, we've scoped the highly confidential label to just the SLT users in the organization. The second use case is where customers want to publish a defined set of labels for all users of their organization. And we call this as a global policy. And in label policy 2, I've published the public, general, and confidential label to all users of the organization. In addition to all of this, there are few settings that are very powerful with the label policy, namely default label. Customers want every document or every email to have a default label associated with it. This can be enabled using the default label settings. In addition, the customers may want every user to justify why he's changing the label on a document, especially if the sensitivity is going low. He can enable this using the justification setting associated with the label policy. The third setting that is critical is mandatory labeling. Certain organizations want every document to be labeled, and they can enable this using mandatory labeling. We don't recommend you should start with this. The last one is related to providing a help link so that the end users know what are the labels that have been configured for their organization, what is the meaning of each of those labels, when these labels should be used. Now that you've seen all the boring stuff related to the admin, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, who's going to show you the rich Office client experience for these labels.
All right, thanks, Kartik. Thanks for getting the admin part out of the way so I can do all the demos with all the devices I have up here. So the first thing I want to mention is Azure IP provides so much value with these sensitivity labels, but it exists on Windows Office. And that's been a limitation for many of the customers who have heterogeneous environments with Macs and iOS and Android devices and so on in their environment. And so we've taken a big bet on that in the Office organization to build in the sensitivity labeling concept natively into the Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook apps across platform. And that's what I'm going to show you today. So if I can figure out this switchy thing. Here I am on my Mac. I'm going to play the role of an information worker in the mergers and acquisitions department. I'm writing up a new merger and acquisition plan for a project codenamed Shanghai. And now here, built right into the Mac Word app, I have a sensitivity button up here, right in the front tab of the ribbon. And that's where all those sensitivity labels show up that Kartik just configured in the administration portal. I can pan through these and hover, and that's where the admin-defined tooltips will show up that show me what these labels mean and when I should use them. If I want to learn more about that, I can click into the Learn More link, and that's where it'll pop up the admin-defined website that Kartik just talked about, so I can read more and maybe contact my IT department for more information. Now, after reading that stuff, I read the tooltips, I read the page, I know how to use the sensitivity labels in my organization. It's clear to me now that the mergers and acquisition documents are highly sensitive documents, and they should be labeled highly confidential. I probably should have known that already, but it took me to the admin page to learn that. So here I go, I'm going to click this one. Ignore that prompt, I am running a debug build, and so you're going to see some phantom prompts there. That won't happen in your real experience, but what you'll see here is I have a header, the watermark, and the footer that got automatically applied to my document. And down here in the bottom in the status bar, this is where document metadata is shown. This shows that highly confidential label is applied, and there's a lock icon here to indicate that this document is encrypted. And it's restricted in a way that only users in my organization that have access to highly confidential data are able to actually open and decrypt this document. And so that's it working natively in Word on the Mac. And now I'm going to switch over to my Android tablet. Here we go. And so now in this demo, I'll open up Word on the Android. Let's say I've shared this document with one of my colleagues who has access to highly confidential data. And let's say this merger and acquisition has gone through and it's public information now. Highly confidential is no longer required for this content, and I need to declassify it, and maybe it's just confidential now or just general now, depending on my IT policy. Here, you'll see the sensitivity button up here in the toolbar, just in the same way that it was on the Mac, and I have the same labels available to me. So now let's say I choose general. I want to downgrade the classification. Because the setting applied to me specifies that I must justify label downgrades from highly sensitive labels to lesser sensitivity, I get this justification prompt. And I can choose whether the label no longer applies, it was incorrect in the first place, or I can provide my own explanation. And all of this information will then flow up to the admin portal for the admin to then audit if they need to. All right, and now I will switch over to my iPad. Come on now. There it is. Okay. Here I'm running iPad, the iOS version of PowerPoint, and I'm going to create a new presentation. And what I'm going to show here is all I did was create a new presentation, but because I have the default label policy configured for me, that means that the general label automatically gets applied to all new content that I create. And so you can see that because there's that little Contoso general watermark that got put on this presentation automatically without me doing anything. And here in the sensitivity button on the toolbar, you'll see that general is already applied to this presentation. And that will ring true for all of the different apps across the Office suite. If that policy is specified for me, that means that all content I create in Office will automatically have that label. And of course, I can go change it as I need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this document general. I'm going to save it to my OneDrive. I guess this is the 7th time I'm trying this demo, presentation 7. We'll give that a second. So that's saved now, and I'll switch back over now to my Windows device. And the point I want to make here is on Windows, we don't quite yet have that native integration the same way that I've been demoing on Mac, iOS, and PowerPoint. But on Windows, there is that AIP add-in. And so what I want to highlight here is we've built this whole story, this whole sensitivity labeling capability with compatibility in mind between AIP and the native solution. So you can rest assured if you already have AIP deployed in your environment, AIP just understands the labels set by native and vice versa. So here running Windows Office, I just have to open up the presentation I just created here, presentation 7, and I'll see refresh recommended, that's something different. But you'll see here with the sensitivity button that's put in here by the AIP add-in, it already knows that this is a general presentation. So I'm just highlighting here that the compatibility is there, and it will be there from day 1. All right, super. I'm going to switch back to the presentation now, and Kartik, okay, cool, we're unlocked. Okay, we're on the screen? Yes, we are. Those are the native labeling experiences there. Oh, real quick, I also want to show you that it doesn't just stop there with Word, Excel, PowerPoint. We've also built in the labeling capabilities into Outlook, and we're building it across platform. What I can show you today, however, is here's Mac Outlook. And you'll see this is an email that I've sent myself that is labeled with the public label. And you see that loud and clear right here in the experience natively, with a link to the Learn More button if I want to learn more about my IT labels. And as I go to compose a new mail, just like all the other apps here in the toolbar, I have the sensitivity button with the same labels, just like you'd expect. And I didn't give Excel any love, so I just want to show you, here it is in Excel as well. Okay, super. Back to the presentation. Now, everything I just showed you is live code that is real, and we're going to be rolling out to the Insider program shortly. Here on the screen, though, I have a mock-up of what it's going to look like in the Outlook mobile app, since I know that's a highly critical piece for many of you. But the concept is the same. I can simply apply a sensitivity label to email that I'm authoring, and it shows up in the consumption and the composition experiences. So this is something that you can look forward to coming up in the coming months here in Outlook mobile. So that was a long-winded way to explain where we're at. I've showed off the manual labeling capabilities across the platforms here in select apps. The gist of it, though, is we're rolling out these capabilities in waves. We want to allow you to get started with the Mac clients. The rollout to the Insider Fast ring of Office is starting today. And so that means that when you get back from your trip from Ignite, you'll be able to get on the Insider program, install the Insider bits on Mac, and start playing with it right away. The other demos that I showed you on Android and iOS will be coming soon in the coming weeks, also in the Insider program, and the rest will trickle in throughout the rest of the year. And by the end of calendar year 2018, that's when we'll have all of these experiences across the board, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, on all the platforms listed here in production, with the exception of the web apps. The web apps will be coming later in calendar year 2019. Now, I mentioned the Office Insider program. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's the opt-in pre-release program from Office that gets you access to early builds across different platforms. I encourage all of you that want to test out features early to opt into this Insider program. And there's a great community there to help with new features and so on as you get to experience those in that ring. Of course, you get more frequent updates, and new features will be flighted on for you, including this one. So I highly encourage you to check that out. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ashish to talk about how you can actually get started with all this great stuff.
Thank you, folks. So before I start, another big round of applause for these folks. Yes. What you have seen, just to recap, is in 30 minutes, you have started with your Security and Compliance Center, created labels, deployed them, and it works across all your Office applications. 30 minutes, that's all it took. Now, what I'm going to talk about is how you can get started with all of this for new customers who are starting to onboard to M365 and SCC, and for existing customers who are already using Azure Information Protection. Yes, this is the session you've actually been waiting for. All right, new customers. It's easy. All you need to do is get started with SCC, create your labels, and roll out all the Office applications to your users. That's it. 2 steps. You saw it just now. That is actually all it takes. The links in here will take you to the portal where you can create the labels. And the second link there will take you to the blog that talks about all our capabilities and will have further links that will guide you to the right places that you need to. This will be recorded, and you can see all of this later, so you can always come back and click on this and get to the right places. All right. Some call-outs here. It says M365 E3, the emphasis on E3, being manual classification and labeling, right? So this is what we have enabled today. The Office clients have all this built in natively. We'll talk about what happens to E5 and automatic classification in a bit. AIP customers, should you be worried? Well, the answer is no, although it's got yes on the slide there. AIP labels interrupt seamlessly with the unified labels. It's the same stuff, which means that if you have the labels deployed today, don't worry, it will just work fine, which is what Mike showed in the last demo there with the Windows AIP add-in. The document that he labeled on another platform with the new unified labeling showed up correctly on Windows with the AIP add-in. That is how it's expected to work. That is how it works. So you can keep the existing labels that you have on your documents and emails if you're already using AIP. If you have an existing AIP label configuration, keep it. It works. So for customers who are thinking about deploying AIP today, go ahead and deploy. Stuff will work, And we have a way for you to try out the new Mac, iOS, Android capabilities that you've just seen. More on the next slide. For customers who have already deployed AIP, and you came here panicking about what you're going to hear, it all just works fine. And continue using the AIP portal, the AIP add-in, and again, the next slide, we'll talk about how you can try out these new capabilities on Mac, iOS, Android. So Mac, iOS, Android for existing AIP customers. There's a small step that involves a little migration in our backend, which you can find a link to here. The migration is in public preview. That comes with all the caveats of public preview. So be careful not to try this out right now on your production tenants, but this is working now, and you can go to the link and try it out right after the session. Once you do your migration of the AIP labels to the unified backend, the link here will guide you through the steps that you need to do to publish policies and get labeling on Mac, iOS, and Android. So existing AIP customers can get Mac, iOS, and Android too. Isn't that awesome? Thank you. Thank you. But more importantly, I mentioned that E5 customers needed a little call out. If you are an E5 customer, you're probably looking forward to automatic classification capabilities like the scanner, AIP scanner, and MCAS. You will still probably need to start with the AIP portal. So the amazing capabilities that we have today, starting in SCC, are available only if you want to go with manual classification and labeling. For customers who are interested in automatic classification and labeling, start with the AIP portal. Very soon, we'll have a way for you to migrate onto the unified portal, all end-to-end. You can just live, breathe, and do everything in the SCC portal. That's coming up soon. Start now, we'll get you there. And the reason I have this confidence, and I'm saying this again, is that because fundamentally the labels are the same. Whether you start with AIP and label your documents, or you start with SCC and label your documents, they are labeled and understood in exactly the same way. A quick wrap up before we go to questions. We talked about this in the beginning. There are a bunch of solutions that comprise Microsoft Information Protection. We just covered 4 of them in some sense. There are multiple sessions that are there outside of ours where you should attend and learn more about everything that we are providing. All of this ties together. So overall, your information security isn't going to come from a single place. It takes a village in some sense, and this is that village. Attend the sessions, learn more about what we are doing. And what are those sessions? Here you go. Arranged neatly for you in a time order, Monday to Friday. Now, there's a bunch of sessions that are happening tomorrow, small theater sessions that you should go for because they'll dive into specific aspects. If you want to learn about the email capabilities, that's coming up. If you want to know what the analytics and reporting story is, that's coming up tomorrow too. So all of this goodness, we can't cover in 45 minutes, unfortunately, is spread out over sessions through this week. Please do attend, and then come visit us at our booth, and we can answer more questions. All right, I think we are done, and we can go on to questions. A big thank you to everyone here. Another round of applause for demoing this stuff. All right. Thank you, folks. Now we are up for questions.
You tell them to come up to the mic.
Step up to the passenger. Step up to the
All right, please do come up to the mic here in order to ask questions so that, yeah.
So for existing AIP customers, we're E5, we've rolled out the existing AIP. We've been hearing mixed things. I know you talked about the new unified labeling for Office Online. That wasn't going to come till next year. What about existing documents using the existing AIP, being able to view those, potentially tag those in the online versions of Office, Word, et cetera, et cetera?
So the restriction still applies. So the way that it really works today is if you start with, if you need E5 capabilities, that is automatic classification, that's only available on the AIP add-in on Windows. Then you have the next level, which is manual classification and labeling, which is available on Mac, iOS, Android, and again, the AIP add-in on Windows. And finally, no classification today on the web. And over time, we'll bring this all up to everyone having manual and then everyone having automatic. It's a matter of time.
So what he was saying then about Office, our Office Online capabilities for 2019 is the same for whether it's the new unified or whether it's
Yes.
E5 AIP.
Yeah.
We won't see that this year.
No.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi. Currently in Outlook, if you classify email as internal, and if you send that email to 5 internal users and 1 external, then email will go out. You can fix this with transport rule, which will look for AP header, and then user will get NDR that, I don't know, email is not aligned with classification, and will see that he has made mistake, and it will send it again only to internal users. What is the plan, and when is the plan to create in piece of software in Outlook that if email is sent to external users, to external recipient with internal classification, that user click send, just pop up and said that classification is wrong.
Check.
So it sounds like, I think you're...
I think I got a live mic here. That's a requirement we hear often from customers, that the NDR experience is not the best. You send the mail, it gets NDR'd, you don't even know about it until maybe the next day, and that ruins your day. We have that on the backlog as something that we want to tackle, but making that more upfront in the user experience when we know they're not going to be able to open it. We don't have plans yet to share at this time in terms of timelines.
Thank you.
Go ahead down there.
Guys, I've got 2 questions. First, are the native capabilities coming to Microsoft Office for Windows? Like without the need to install add-ons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question's about today you need an AIP add-in if you want to use sensitivity labeling in the Windows Office apps. Yes, we are currently building that natively so that in the future you will no longer need to use an add-in at all. We expect to have the manual labeling component of that on Windows natively built in by the end of this calendar year. Now what that means though, the AIP add-in today does more than the manual labeling. So we will give you the control to choose whether you want to continue to use AIP or you want to use the native manual capability that we're building in. And over time with updates to the Office 365 apps where we're building this, we'll be introducing automatic labeling and so on to build parity with what AIP has. And at that point you can fully switch over. But we want to give you the option by the end of the calendar year, if manual labeling is all that you need, and you don't need to use the AIP add-in anymore if you don't want to, you'll have that by the end of the calendar year in native Windows, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook as well.
So it's going to be native Windows and Office, correct? At some point.
Yeah, so I mean the native Office apps on Windows is what I'm referring to.
So, all right, and then what's going to happen with the rest of currently existing functionality of their AIP software? Is it coming to like Mac OS?
Yeah, so everything I showed you today is all around manual labeling.
Right.
Manual labeling is where we're starting across platform. We'll have the same set of functionality on all those platforms for manual labeling first by the end of the calendar year. And then subsequent functionality that we add in, like automatic labeling and so on, we'll be building that across the suite, across platform as well, but that'll be in 2019.
Right, and what's about the like files and documents that are out of ecosystem of Microsoft? Currently today you can label JPEG, PNG, PDFs with the Windows Explorer extension, but this capability doesn't exist, for example, on Mac OS. So is there like a plans or roadmap to extend that?
On Windows, you still need the AIP add-in to protect those non-Office files.
Right.
And currently, there is no plan for Mac OS.
All right, so there is no changes or anything like that planned?
No, not yet. But it's feedback that's part of our backlog. We'll have to look at it and see when we can get to it.
Okay, thank you guys.
Label JPEGs, encryption.
We have a business requirement for project-based data classification. One of the ways that we've done that in the past with things like Outlook is to leverage the built-in policy mechanisms. Is there a practical limit to the number of policies that are supported? Like, would it support thousands of policies a year being generated? Or?
So if you're, okay, well, my mic is not working. So there we go. So which, you were asking about a policy-based system. Which system are you referring to with your policy controls?
So you explicitly kind of listed out that you could have multiple policies that you could apply to different groups. So if we applied one policy per group, then
what are the practical limits of the number of labels that you can deploy or the number of scoped label policies that you can configure for your organization? That's a great question. I don't know if, I think it's hundreds of labels and label policies is what the system will enable. To be fair, I think most customers we know do not need that expansive set for sensitivity labels, just generally on how, the different rankings of sensitive content. We haven't seen that used yet, but the system itself supports, as I said, I think, I don't remember if it's hundreds of labels and hundreds of label policies. So you can intersect those and use them as you would choose. I'd say it'd be great feedback if you're not able to meet a specific business objective, let us know, but I would be surprised if it's still met.
I'll take it offline.
Okay, excellent.
Another thing to call out there is a practical limit to how long our list can be in Office. So we encourage you to use scoping and push out the project-based labels to the right people and keep the list small in general.
Yes.
Sorry, folks, we'll have to close out the session. We'll just take questions.
We'll hang out here around the stage. We can take questions up here, but that will officially conclude now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.